Hi, Lynn Chung here. I'm an artist and therapist. So today I'm going to have a chat to you about something that seems to come up quite a lot for people in their art practice, and that's this idea of the inner critic. Something that people do seem to struggle with actually, which is their inner dialogue sometimes around their work, around their art process, around perhaps getting themselves out there, putting themselves out in front of people. We often seem to carry quite a lot of negative and unhelpful messages actually. I do hear people saying things to themselves about both their work and perhaps the way in which they put themselves out there in ways that they wouldn't ever say to anybody else. Some of the comments that we make to ourselves, we would never say to a friend or a fellow artist. I do find myself being really interested about that. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about this morning, and I hope that it'll actually be useful for some of my fellow artists out there, is an idea that comes from the therapy that I do, which is about ego states and personality. So this is from transactional analysis, which is the type of therapist that I am, and it's by a chap called by the name of Eric Byrne. And what Eric was talking about was the idea that the personality has got three parts to it. So I'm going to explain a little bit of theory, fairly quick and simple explanation actually, which I hope you'll find useful, and then go on to talk about how this might be practically of help actually, how you could introduce a different mindset to your artist practice. So the idea of ego states is that there are three parts to the personality, a parent part, an adult part, and a child part. And the idea is that each of these parts is a consistent pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaviour. So that when we're in the parent part of us, there'll be patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaviour which is fairly consistent over time. Okay, fairly consistent over time. So today I'm not going to talk about adult and child particularly. I'm just going to focus on parent because I think that to a very large extent is where this idea of the inner critic comes from. So if we think about how does this evolve, where does it develop from, I think what the ideas behind this are that it comes from when we're children. So we see significant others. They may be parents, they may be adoptive parents, foster parents, caretakers, aunts, uncles, siblings sometimes, next door neighbours, teachers, people who've been involved in our upbringing in some way and helping us learn maybe. And we identify quite strongly sometimes, or we feel that they are important to us, so we identify with them. And we observe how they both behave to us and how they behave to other people, or they respond to the world. And we sort of take that in. We identify with their response to things and we take that in. We sort of swallow it whole. So it becomes part of us. And then what happens is over time is we begin to replay and revisit that experience with ourselves, so that then when we are an artist, in our studio, we go back to some of the messages and some of the experiences that we might hear. So if we've learned, for example, that one of the ways to get through something difficult is to push yourself through it, if that was the message that we picked up, maybe around something at school or maybe at sports or something like that, or you're just going to get on with it, that's a very common message, isn't it? So we might just push ourselves past the point of actually being helpful, or we might have picked up some perfectionism from people where it's not okay to make mistakes and actually you have to get things right first time. That's a very common one I think for people. So that when we find ourselves in our art practice wanting to explore, we bring a sense of perfectionism to it, that actually it's not okay just to play for the sake of playing, but actually things have to be finished. I mean, this is something that I have a lot of. I do find that sometimes I go up to the studio and there's a kind of a slight expectation that I'm aware of in myself, that actually every single piece of work that I do, even if it's playing on my sketchbook, on some level be some kind of finished piece. When I get away from that, I'm usually a lot freer and able to express myself than when I get myself locked into this headspace of it's got to be a finished piece, I've got to be satisfied with it. So that's an example really of how this can play out for us, I think. So we'll pick up these messages, we take them in from significant people, they can be from a whole range of different people and from the environment, and then we replay this with us ourselves, and over time it forms this kind of, the inner critic in a way is almost like a composite voice of lots of people who've been significant to us as we're growing up. So what do we then do with this? If we know that that's where this has come from, that actually it's not one individual but actually lots of different people. And sometimes the intention behind that could have actually been positive. It may have been, a a limitation in the person who was taking care of us or who was working with us in some way or teaching us, that they themselves didn't know how to express this in a positive and useful way, and may have done it in a way which actually we found difficult. And of course the other bit of this is that because we were children, we will have heard it in a certain way. We'll have heard it with the mind and the expression and the understanding of a young child. And that's not the same with an adult. We're not able to filter it in the same way. So what do we then do? How can we work with this? Why is it useful to know this? Well, 2 or 3 things that I've been thinking about around this. One, I think, is if we can begin to update this to a more positive intention, that can be really helpful. So think about, what was the real intention behind this? What was the intention behind telling us to really focus on things and getting them right? Well, I guess it's about excellence, actually. Now, there's nothing wrong with excellence. That's actually quite useful. If we're told to sort of, well, you just got to get on with it, haven't you? You've got to be strong around these things. Well, there's something actually about being able to be stoic and, be able to see things through. And we can reframe that in a positive way, that actually sometimes those things can be helpful. I think the balance is always useful to know when it's getting in the way. Okay, so that's the first point, I think. Find the balance and reframe to a more positive intention. The second one is we might actually listen to the words and the things that we say to ourselves and update those in a way which is more useful. So, this idea of getting things right all the time, well, it is useful to get things right, but good enough is good enough. So that might be a way that you could reframe that particular message. There's lots of different ways we can address that. We can come up with lots of, different messages and different updates, really, of things that could be more helpful and less limiting, I think, in the way in which we think about them. And the final one, I think, for me is, when messages are really, really negative and there is no way to reframe them, and perhaps they've come from people whose intention wasn't helpful, then I think, the only thing we can do with those is just turn the volume down, actually, really turn the volume down and refuse to listen to it, and to bring in a more adult sense of ourselves as a way of thinking about this, to say thank you to that parent voice for, the bits that were useful, and actually, no, I'm not going to listen to the bits that aren't helpful. Okay, so that's just some thoughts from me around our inner critic and some of the ways in which we can deal with it. I'm going to do a few more of these Instagram TV sort of series. I'll talk more about adult and how that can be useful as how we can harness the energy of our adult to support ourselves as artists. And I'll also talk about the child part of us, and maybe some of the things that we can do to support the child part of us, again, as well, in our work as artists. I hope this has been useful. Any comments, love to hear them. Perhaps post them in the bit below, or send me a message. And yeah, I'll be back again soon. Okay, have a good day. Speak to you soon. Cheers. Bye.